This is the story of Sarah, a woman whose mother constantly shamed her for being just a waitress and having no ambition. Little did her family know, while they were busy looking down on her uniform, Sarah was secretly building a billion-dollar tech empire from her kitchen table. It is a powerful tale of silent success and the moment a daughter finally liberates herself from the need for her mother's approval. The dinner was at a restaurant Sarah could not afford. Her mother had chosen it, of course, a sleek, modern bistro, downtown with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs, and a menu where the prices were listed without dollar signs, as if the mere presence of currency symbols would sully the experience. Margaret had made the reservation for 6 o'clock, knowing full well that Sarah's shift at the diner ended at 5:30, and that she would have no time to go home and change. "Just come as you are," Margaret had said on the phone, her voice carrying that particular brightness that meant she was planning something. "We haven't seen you in so long, Sarah. Your father misses you." Sarah's father had been dead for 8 years, but Margaret had never let the truth interfere with a good manipulation. Sarah arrived at 6:07 p.m., still wearing her uniform, a pale blue polyester dress with a white collar and a small stained apron that she had forgotten to remove in her rush to catch the bus. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there was a smear of ketchup on her sleeve that she hadn't had time to clean. The hostess looked at her with the particular expression of someone who was trying very hard not to look judgmental and failing entirely. "I'm meeting my mother," Sarah said. "Margaret Chen. She has a reservation." The hostess's eyes flickered over Sarah's uniform, her ponytail, her ketchup-stained sleeve. "Of course. Right this way." She led Sarah through the dining room, past tables of people in crisp shirts and elegant dresses, their conversations a low, civilized hum. Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she passed, the brief, assessing glances that catalogued her uniform, her worn sneakers, her complete failure to belong. She had grown used to those glances over the years. They no longer stung the way they once had. They were simply data, information about a world she had learned to navigate from the outside. Margaret was seated at a table near the window, a glass of white wine already in front of her. She was wearing a silk blouse in deep burgundy, her silver hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless. She looked like she belonged in this restaurant, among these people, in this life she had carefully constructed since her husband's death. Across from her sat Sarah's Aunt Patricia, Margaret's younger sister, dressed in a similar uniform of quiet wealth. And beside Patricia sat Sarah's cousin Vivian, the lawyer, in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. Vivian smiled when she saw Sarah, a genuine smile, Sarah thought. Though it was hard to tell with Vivian, she had always been kind to Sarah in her distant, distracted way. They had grown up together, shared summers at their grandmother's house, built blanket forts, and told each other secrets. But their paths had diverged sharply after college. Vivian had gone to law school, passed the bar, joined a prestigious firm. Sarah had dropped out of her business program in her junior year, taken a job at a diner, and disappeared into a life that made no sense to anyone but her. "Sarah!" Vivian stood and embraced her, seemingly unconcerned by her uniform or her ketchup stain. "It's so good to see you. You look exhausted. Are you sleeping at all?" "Not enough," Sarah admitted. "Double shift a day, but I wanted to see you." Margaret did not stand. She looked at Sarah with the particular expression she had perfected over the years, a mixture of disappointment, disapproval, and something that might have been genuine confusion. She had never understood why Sarah had chosen this life. She had never tried to understand. "Sarah," she said, her voice cool, "you're late. 7 minutes. The bus was delayed. You could have taken a cab. I would have paid for it." "I know, but the bus was fine." Sarah sat down in the empty chair beside Vivian, across from her mother. The server appeared almost instantly, a young man with a warm smile and a notepad. He looked at Sarah, at her uniform, and his smile flickered with recognition. He had probably worked a double shift himself recently. He knew what it meant. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked. "Just water, please. Thank you." Margaret's lips tightened. She had always believed that ordering water in a nice restaurant was a sign of poverty, of not belonging. She would have preferred Sarah order a cocktail she couldn't afford just to maintain appearances. But Sarah had stopped performing for her years ago. The server left, and an awkward silence settled over the table. Aunt Patricia busied herself with her menu. Vivian looked at Sarah with quiet concern. Margaret stared at Sarah as if she were cataloging every flaw, every failure, every way she had disappointed her. "I didn't raise a daughter to take orders from strangers for $5 tips," Margaret said finally. Her voice was not quiet. It carried across the table, across the neighboring tables, across the entire section of the restaurant. Heads turned, conversations paused. Sarah felt the weight of strangers' eyes on her, assessing, judging, confirming what her mother had just announced to the room. Sarah was an embarrassment, Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly, as if she wanted to ensure no one missed her point. "You were so bright, Sarah, so full of promise. And now you're, what? Serving coffee to truck drivers and cleaning up after people who have done something with their lives? Why can't you be like your cousin?" Vivian passed the bar on her first try. "She's already handling her own cases. She makes her family proud." Vivian's face flushed. "Aunt Margaret, please. Sarah's path is just different. That doesn't make it wrong." "Different," Margaret repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Yes, different. That's a generous word for it." Sarah said nothing. She had learned years ago that arguing with her mother was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. Margaret believed what she wanted to believe. Facts were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the story she told herself, the story in which she was the long-suffering mother of a disappointing daughter, burdened with the weight of Sarah's failures. What Margaret didn't know, what she had never bothered to ask, was that those $5 tips were not being spent on frivolous things. They were being saved. Every penny, every dollar, every crumpled bill slipped into a coffee-stained apron pocket. They were being funneled into a business account that had been growing slowly and steadily for the past 3 years. An account that funded a company Sarah had built from nothing in the margins of her life, while everyone around her believed she was simply a waitress going nowhere. The server returned with Sarah's water. She thanked him quietly, and he gave her a small, sympathetic smile. He had heard Margaret's words. Everyone had heard Margaret's words. "So," Margaret said, her voice shifting into a brighter, more performative register. "Vivian, tell us about the Henderson case. I heard it's quite the coup for your firm." Vivian glanced at Sarah, her expression apologetic. But she was a good daughter, and she knew her role. She began to describe the case, a complex corporate litigation that she was handling with a senior partner. Margaret listened with rapt attention, nodding at all the right moments, asking questions that demonstrated her complete lack of legal knowledge, but her absolute commitment to appearing knowledgeable. Sarah sat quietly, sipping her water, letting the conversation flow around her like water around a stone. She was used to this. She had been invisible at family gatherings for years, a ghost at the table, present but not acknowledged. It no longer hurt. It was simply the way things were. But beneath the table, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it discreetly, a habit she had perfected during long shifts at the diner, when checking your phone openly was grounds for a lecture from the manager. The notification was from her business partner, a woman named Amara, who had believed in Sarah's vision when no one else had. "The prototype is ready. Initial tests are exceeding all projections. The investors want a meeting next week. Sarah, this is really happening." Sarah slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up. Her mother was still talking, still performing, still basking in the reflected glow of Vivian's success. She had no idea that her disappointing daughter, the waitress, the embarrassment, was about to change everything. The dinner ended 2 hours later. Margaret paid the bill with a flourish, making sure everyone at the neighboring tables could see her platinum card. She air-kissed Sarah's cheek and told her to think about going back to school, as if she were a teenager who had simply lost her way. Aunt Patricia gave her a pitying smile. Vivian hugged her tightly and whispered, "Call me if you need anything. I mean it." Sarah walked out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air. The bus stop was 2 blocks away, and she had just enough time to catch the last one home. As she walked, she pulled out her phone and typed a response to Amara. "I'll be there. Tell the investors we're ready. Tell them we've been ready for years." Sarah hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The bus arrived, hissing to a stop at the curb. She climbed aboard, found a seat near the back, and watched the city slide past the window. Her uniform was still stained with ketchup. Her feet ached from the double shift. Her mother's words still echoed in her ears. "You're an embarrassment to this family." Sarah smiled. It was a small, private smile, the smile of a woman who knew something the world did not. Let her mother think she was an embarrassment. Let her believe she was nothing but a waitress, taking orders for $5 tips. The truth was something her mother would never see coming. And when it arrived, when the world finally understood what Sarah had been building in the silence of her so-called failure, Margaret would have to confront the daughter she had dismissed. Sarah could not wait to see her face. The bus rumbled on through the night, carrying her home to her small apartment, her laptop, and the business plan that was about to change everything. The bread of shame had been eaten. The feast was still to come. The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Sarah did not hit snooze. She had learned through brutal experience that those 9 extra minutes of half-sleep were a trap, a seductive lie that left her more exhausted than if she had simply gotten up when the alarm first sounded. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, planted her feet on the cold floor, and let the shock of it wake her fully. Outside her narrow window, the city was still dark, the streetlights casting pools of yellow onto the empty sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a garbage truck rumbled through its route, its mechanical groan a familiar soundtrack to her mornings. Her apartment was small, a studio in a building that had seen better decades, with thin walls and a radiator that clanked like a dying heartbeat, and a kitchen that was barely large enough to turn around in. But it was hers. Every square foot of it was hers, paid for with money she had earned herself, and that mattered more than square footage or granite countertops or any of the things her mother believed defined success. The kitchen table was the heart of Sarah's empire. It was a scarred oak thing she had found at a thrift store for $40, its surface marked with the rings of countless coffee cups and the faint impressions of meals eaten by strangers she would never know. She had sanded it down and oiled it herself, a small act of restoration that felt like a promise. On that table sat her laptop, a refurbished model that had cost less than her mother's monthly wine budget, and a collection of notebooks filled with diagrams, calculations, and the slow, painstaking architecture of a company she was building from nothing. Green Grid. The name had come to her during a late-night shift at the diner as she was wiping down tables and thinking about the inefficiencies she saw everywhere, in the way food was wasted, in the way energy was consumed, in the way small businesses struggled to compete with giants who had resources they could never match. She had imagined a platform that would democratize sustainable technology, making it accessible and affordable for the kind of places where she worked, family restaurants, independent retailers, the small, unglamorous businesses that formed the backbone of every community. A grid of green solutions, distributed and resilient. Green Grid. Her mother thought Sarah was unemployed. Margaret told her friends Sarah was finding herself, or taking some time, or when she was feeling particularly cruel, just not cut out for the real world. She had no idea that Sarah was working harder than she had ever worked in her life, that her days began before dawn and ended long after midnight, that she was building something her mother could not see because she had never bothered to look. The waitressing was real. Sarah had not invented it as a cover story. Every morning at 6 a.m., she arrived at the Blue Plate Diner, a 24-hour establishment on the edge of the industrial district that served truck drivers and night shift workers, and the kind of people her mother would cross the street to avoid. Sarah wore a pale blue uniform with a white collar and a small apron, and she carried pots of coffee and plates of eggs and the particular patience required to serve people who were often tired, hungry, and not at their best. The work was hard. Her feet ached by the end of every shift. Her hands were perpetually chapped from washing dishes and wiping counters. She had learned to balance 4 plates on one arm and to remember complex orders without writing them down, and to smile at customers who had not smiled at her first. She had learned to diffuse conflicts, to manage chaos, to solve problems on the fly, while keeping a dozen competing demands in her head. These were skills that no business school could teach, and they were the foundation of everything she was building. At 2 p.m., her shift ended. Sarah changed out of her uniform in the tiny staff bathroom, pulled on her civilian clothes, and walked the 12 blocks to her apartment. She did not take the bus. Those 12 blocks were her only exercise, her only time outdoors, her only moments of transition between the two lives she was living. By 2:30, she was at her kitchen table, laptop open, notebook spread around her, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the counter. Green Grid began as a series of conversations. Sarah had noticed during her shifts at the diner how much food went to waste, not because anyone was careless, but because the systems for tracking inventory and predicting demand were designed for larger operations with more resources. The owner, a gruff, kind-hearted man named Gus, who had run the Blue Plate for 30 years, did his best with paper records and intuition, but he was losing money every month on spoiled produce and over-ordered supplies. When Sarah asked him why he didn't use any of the new inventory management apps, he laughed and said, "Those are for fancy restaurants with fancy budgets. I can't afford a $1,000 software subscription." That was the spark. What if there was a platform designed specifically for small businesses like Gus's? Affordable, intuitive, built on sustainable principles that reduced waste and saved money. What if it wasn't just software, but a suite of interconnected tools? Energy monitoring, supply chain optimization, waste reduction strategies. What if Sarah built it? She had no investors. She had no business degree. She had no connections to the tech world or the venture capital firms that funded startups like hers. What she had was a waitressing job that paid her rent and fed her, a laptop that was slow but functional, and an unshakable belief that she could figure it out. The first 6 months were a blur of learning. Sarah taught herself to code, not elegantly, but functionally, enough to build a crude prototype. She read everything she could find about sustainable technology, supply chain logistics, and small business economics. She talked to Gus and other small business owners in the neighborhood, asking questions, taking notes, understanding their pain points. She built the first version of Green Grid on a free platform, using templates and tutorials and the kind of stubborn persistence that came from having no other options. The first user was Gus. Sarah installed the prototype on the ancient computer in his back office, showed him how to track his inventory and predict his orders, and waited. A month later, Gus called her into his office and showed her the numbers. His food waste was down 40%. His supply costs had dropped by nearly a quarter. He was saving real money. Money he could use to give his employees raises, to fix the broken freezer, to keep the diner alive for another year. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. "Nothing," Sarah said. "Just tell people. If it works for you, tell other people like you." He did. Word spread through the small business community, not through advertising or social media campaigns, but through the quiet, persistent hum of people who had been helped and wanted to return the favor. A bakery in the next neighborhood signed on, then a hardware store, then a small grocery. Each new user taught Sarah something, revealed a flaw in the system, suggested an improvement she hadn't considered. She iterated constantly, rebuilding the platform in the margins of her life between shifts at the diner and the few hours of sleep she allowed herself. By the end of the first year, Green Grid had 50 users and was generating enough revenue to cover its costs. By the end of the second year, it had 300 users and was turning a small profit. By the end of the third year, the year her mother hosted the dinner where she called Sarah an embarrassment, it had over 1,000 small businesses on the platform, a waiting list of hundreds more, and the attention of investors who had begun to hear whispers about the waitress who had built a sustainable tech company from her kitchen table. Sarah's mother knew none of this. Margaret had never asked about Sarah's life, her work, her dreams. She had only ever measured the distance between what Sarah was and what she believed Sarah should be, and she had found her daughter wanting every time. When people asked about Sarah, Margaret told them she was still figuring things out, or taking a break from the corporate world, or, when she was feeling honest, just a waitress. The shame she felt about Sarah's supposed failures was a constant presence in their relationship, a wall Margaret had built that Sarah had stopped trying to climb. But beneath that wall, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, Sarah was building an empire. Not the kind of empire her mother would recognize. No corner office, no designer wardrobe, no impressive title to drop at dinner parties, but an empire nonetheless. An empire built on the belief that small businesses mattered, that sustainability was not a luxury for the wealthy, that the skills she had learned carrying coffee and wiping tables were the same skills that could change the world. The night before the Forbes interview, Sarah worked a double shift at the diner. Her feet ached. Her uniform was stained with ketchup and coffee. She came home at midnight, showered off the smell of the grill, and sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email that had arrived that afternoon. Dear Ms. Chen, we are pleased to inform you that Green Grid has been selected for the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in the category of social impact. We would like to schedule an interview and photo shoot at your earliest convenience. Sarah read the email 3 times. Then she set down her phone and looked around her small apartment, at the scarred oak table, the clanking radiator, the narrow window that looked out over a city that had no idea who she was. She thought about her mother, about the dinner, about the word embarrassment thrown across the table like a weapon. She smiled. It was a small, private smile, the smile of a woman who had built something from nothing and was finally ready to be seen. The kitchen table empire had grown beyond these 4 walls, and tomorrow the world would know it. The photograph was taken on a rooftop in downtown San Francisco, with the city skyline rising behind Sarah like a promise fulfilled. She was wearing a charcoal suit, tailored, elegant, the kind of garment her mother had always wanted her to wear, and her hair was swept back in a sleek, professional style. Her expression was calm, confident, the expression of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to claim. The photographer had told her to look directly into the lens, to imagine she was looking at everyone who had ever doubted her. She had not needed to imagine. The headline read, "The Waitress Who Built a $1 Billion Grid, Sarah Chen and the Green Grid Revolution." Beneath it, in smaller type, "How a Diner Waitress Bootstrapped a Sustainable Tech Empire from Her Kitchen Table and Changed the Way Small Businesses Think About Energy Forever." The issue hit newsstands on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was in New York preparing for a series of investor meetings when her phone began to buzz. Not the usual rhythm of notifications, a text here, an email there, but a relentless, insistent cascade that made her pocket vibrate like a living thing. She ignored it for as long as she could, focusing on the presentation she was about to give to a room full of people who, until recently, would never have taken a meeting with a former waitress. But the buzzing continued, and continued, and continued. Finally, during a brief break, Sarah pulled out her phone and looked at the screen. Dozens of notifications, text messages from numbers she didn't recognize, voicemails from relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, social media alerts, friend requests, follows, tags in posts she had never seen. Her cousin Vivian had sent a text that simply read, "Oh my God, Sarah, oh my God. Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah smiled and set the phone aside. The meetings came first. The meetings always came first. That was how she had built Green Grid, not by chasing recognition, but by doing the work day after day. In the quiet hours when no one was watching, the recognition could wait. Margaret Chen was at an airport newsstand in Chicago when she saw it. She was traveling to visit her sister Patricia, a trip she made twice a year, always complaining about the inconvenience but secretly relishing the opportunity to perform her role as the successful put-together sibling. She had just purchased a bottle of overpriced water and a magazine about celebrity homes when her eye caught the cover of Forbes. The woman in the photograph was familiar. Hauntingly familiar. The shape of the jaw, the tilt of the head, the slight, knowing smile. Margaret stared at the face, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be true. Her daughter was a waitress. Her daughter wore a stained polyester uniform and carried coffee to truck drivers. Her daughter was an embarrassment, a disappointment, a cautionary tale she trotted out at dinner parties to illustrate the importance of applying oneself. But the woman on the cover of Forbes was none of those things. The woman on the cover of Forbes was powerful, successful, the kind of woman Margaret had always wanted her daughter to become, and had long ago given up hoping she ever would. She picked up the magazine with trembling hands. The paper was slick and heavy, the photograph even more striking in person. She read the headline once, twice, 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. The waitress who built a billion-dollar grid. Waitress, billion-dollar. The 2 words did not belong together. They could not belong together. And yet there they were, printed in bold type beneath her daughter's confident, knowing face. Margaret's phone began to buzz. At first, she ignored it. She was too stunned, too disoriented, too consumed by the impossible image in her hands. But the buzzing continued. Text after text, call after call, a cascade of notifications that demanded her attention. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. Patricia. Margaret, is this true? Sarah is on the cover of Forbes? Vivian. Aunt Margaret, did you know about this? Why didn't you tell us? This is incredible. Her Bridge Club group chat, which had been silent for weeks, was suddenly alive with messages. Margaret, your daughter is famous. I just saw Sarah on the news. Why did you always say she was unemployed? Unemployed. The word echoed in Margaret's mind, a small, sharp stone of shame. She had told everyone Sarah was unemployed. She had told them her daughter was lazy, unmotivated, a disappointment. She had hidden Sarah's waitressing job because she was ashamed of it, and she had never once asked what else her daughter might be doing with her time. Now the truth was splashed across the cover of a magazine that millions of people would see. The waitress, the billionaire, the daughter she had dismissed and diminished and tried to hide. She had built an empire from nothing, and Margaret had not even known it existed. Her phone buzzed again, a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it automatically, her voice hollow. Mrs. Chen, this is Rebecca from the Wall Street Journal. We're doing a profile on your daughter, and we'd love to get some family perspective. Can you tell us what Sarah was like as a child? What was the moment you knew she was destined for greatness? Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? That she had never believed in her daughter? That she had called her an embarrassment in public, had dismissed her work as shameful, had hidden her from the world because she didn't fit the image of success Margaret had constructed, that she had no idea who her daughter really was? I'll have to call you back, she managed, and hung up. She stood in the middle of the airport newsstand, the Forbes magazine clutched in her trembling hands, her phone buzzing with the voices of everyone who had ever ignored her daughter and now wanted to claim a piece of her success. The other travelers flowed around her, oblivious, their lives unchanged by the small, private earthquake that had just shattered Margaret's understanding of everything. Her daughter was a billionaire. Her daughter had built something extraordinary, and Margaret had not been there for a single moment of it. Sarah learned about her mother's discovery from Vivian, who called her that evening, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. She saw the magazine at the airport, Vivian said. Patricia told me. Apparently, she just stood there for like 10 minutes, not moving, not talking, just staring at your face. Then she bought every single copy they had and walked away. Sarah laughed. She couldn't help it. The image of her mother, the woman who had called her an embarrassment in a crowded restaurant, buying up every copy of Forbes like she could somehow control the narrative, was too perfect. Every copy? Every single one. The cashier thought she was insane. Vivian paused. Sarah, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell me? I would have been so proud of you. I would have helped you. Sarah thought about the question. It was a fair one, and Vivian deserved an honest answer. Because I needed to do it alone, she said finally. Not because I didn't trust you, because I needed to prove to myself that I could. That I wasn't just the sum of what everyone expected me to be. That I could build something from nothing, with no help, no connections, no safety net. And I did. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I understand, she said softly. I don't like it, but I understand. And Sarah, I'm so proud of you. Not because you're on a magazine cover, because you did it your way. You always have. Sarah thanked her and hung up. Then she sat in her hotel room, looking out at the New York skyline, and let herself feel it. The years of exhaustion, of double shifts and sleepless nights, of building something in the dark while the world believed she was nothing. It had all led to this moment, not the magazine cover. That was just a symbol. The real victory was the company itself, the 1,000 small businesses that were saving money and reducing waste and building more sustainable futures because of what she had created. The real victory was the woman she had become. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, expecting another message from a distant relative or a journalist looking for a quote. But this one was different. This one was from her mother. Sarah, I saw the magazine. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? She stared at the message for a long time. Her mother, the woman who had spent years dismissing her, diminishing her, hiding her from the world because she didn't fit her narrow definition of success. She wanted to know why Sarah hadn't told her, as if she had ever given her a reason to share her life, as if she had ever asked with genuine curiosity what Sarah was building. Sarah typed a response, then deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, she wrote, "You never asked, Mom. You only judged. I stopped waiting for you to see me a long time ago. I built this for myself, not for you. I hope you can be happy for me now, but if you can't, that's okay. I'm happy enough for both of us." She hit send and set the phone aside. Outside, the city glittered, a million lights against the darkening sky. Somewhere, in an airport hotel room, her mother was probably reading her message, surrounded by stacks of Forbes magazines she had bought in a desperate attempt to control a story that had already escaped her. Sarah didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt free, free of the need for her mother's approval, free of the weight of her disappointment, free to be exactly who she was, without apology or explanation. The waitress, the founder, the woman on the cover of Forbes, all of them were her. And for the first time in her life, Sarah didn't need anyone else to believe it. She believed it herself. The gala was held at the top of the city, in a ballroom with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the skyline like a kingdom surveying its domain. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light refracting into tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The guests were a constellation of wealth and influence, tech founders and venture capitalists, politicians and philanthropists, the kind of people who had once seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars themselves. Now, Sarah moved among them as an equal, her name on the guest list, her company on the lips of people who had never heard of the Blue Plate Diner. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color her mother had always said was too bold for her. The fabric was silk, simple and elegant, and it flowed around her like water as she walked. At her throat hung a single pearl, not from a jewelry store, but from the small box of her grandmother's things that she had managed to save from her mother's periodic decluttering. It was modest, unassuming, and worth more to her than any diamond. The award ceremony had concluded an hour ago. Green Grid had been honored with the Innovation in Sustainability Prize, a crystal trophy that now sat on a table near the stage, surrounded by flowers and the lingering applause of people who had finally learned her name. Sarah had given a short speech thanking her team, her customers, the small business owners who had believed in Green Grid before anyone else. She had not thanked her mother. The omission was deliberate, and no one noticed but her. She was standing near the windows, watching the city lights flicker below, when she heard her mother's voice. "Sarah! Sarah, darling!" The voice was bright, warm, dripping with a maternal affection that Sarah had never heard directed at her. She turned slowly, and there she was, Margaret Chen, her mother, draped in expensive jewelry and wearing a gown of pale gold that probably cost more than Sarah's first year of rent. Her silver hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless, her smile wide and practiced. She was gliding toward Sarah through the crowd, her arms already extending for an embrace, her face arranged in an expression of pure, radiant pride. Behind her, Sarah could see a small cluster of her mother's friends, the same women who had been at the dinner where Margaret called her an embarrassment, the same women who had nodded sympathetically when she described her disappointing daughter. They were watching with bright, curious eyes, eager to witness the touching reunion between the proud mother and her successful child. "I always knew you had it in you, Sarah," Margaret gushed, her voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I told everyone that waitressing was just your way of learning the industry from the ground up. Such a clever strategy, really, getting your hands dirty, understanding the real world. I'm so proud of you." She reached for Sarah, her arms open, her smile radiant. Sarah stepped aside. It was a small movement, subtle, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but it was enough. Margaret's arms closed on empty air, and her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, smoothing her gown and laughing as if the missed embrace were a charming quirk rather than a deliberate rejection. "Sarah, darling, don't be shy," she said, her voice still bright but with a slight edge now. "Everyone here is so impressed with you. I've been telling them all about how you got your start. The waitressing was my idea, you know. I suggested it to you years ago, remember? I said, 'Sarah, if you want to understand business, you need to start at the bottom.' And you did. You listened to your mother?" Sarah looked at her, this woman who had spent years dismissing her, diminishing her, hiding her from the world because she didn't fit her narrow definition of success. This woman who had called her an embarrassment in a crowded restaurant, loud enough for strangers to hear. This woman who had never once asked about her life, her work, her dreams. She was standing in front of Sarah now, draped in borrowed pride, rewriting history in real time for an audience of people she wanted to impress. Sarah reached into her clutch and pulled out a copy of the Forbes magazine. She had brought it with her deliberately, knowing her mother would be here, knowing this moment would come. She handed it to her. "No, Mother," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, quiet, the voice of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to claim. "You didn't tell everyone I was learning the industry. You told everyone I was an embarrassment. You told them I was lazy, unmotivated, a disappointment. You hid my waitressing job because you were ashamed of it, and you never once asked what else I might be doing with my time." Margaret's smile froze. Her eyes darted to the side, to her friends, to the other guests who were now watching with undisguised interest. "Sarah, darling, I don't think this is the time or place." "You made it the time and place," Sarah interrupted gently. "You made it the time and place at that dinner 3 years ago, when you called me an embarrassment loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. You made it the time and place every time you told your friends I was still figuring things out or taking a break from the real world. You made it the time and place every time you looked at me with disappointment because I wasn't living the life you had imagined for me." Sarah gestured at the ballroom around them, the crystal chandeliers, the wealthy guests, the crystal trophy on its table of honor. This life, the one I built, it doesn't belong to you. You don't get to claim it now because it finally looks like something you can be proud of. You didn't build it. You didn't support it. You didn't even know it existed until you saw my face on a magazine cover. Margaret's face had gone pale. Her practiced smile had vanished, replaced by something raw and exposed. Behind her, her friends were exchanging glances, their expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort. They had heard Margaret talk about Sarah for years. They had absorbed her narrative of the disappointing daughter, the embarrassment, the cautionary tale. Now they were watching that narrative crumble in real time. "Sarah," Margaret whispered. Her voice was small now, stripped of its performance. "I'm your mother. I only ever wanted what was best for you." "I know," Sarah said, "but you never asked me what I thought was best for me. You only told me what you thought I should be, and when I didn't fit that mold, you decided I was a failure rather than questioning whether the mold was wrong." She paused, letting the words settle. "I'm not a failure, Mom. I never was. I was just building something you couldn't see because you never bothered to look." Sarah stepped closer to her mother, close enough that only Margaret could hear her next words. "I'm glad I didn't listen to you," she said softly, "because if I had, I'd still be trying to fit into your version of success instead of owning my own. I'd still be chasing your approval instead of building something that matters. I'd still be the daughter you wanted instead of the woman I am." She pulled back and looked at Margaret, this woman who had given her life and then spent years making her feel like she had wasted it. Margaret was crying now, silent tears tracking through her carefully applied makeup. Sarah didn't know if they were tears of regret or shame or simply the shock of being seen clearly for the first time in her life. It didn't matter. Sarah had stopped needing her mother's tears a long time ago. "Enjoy the gala, Mother," Sarah said. "The food is excellent." "I know because I helped design the sustainability guidelines for the catering." She smiled, a small, private smile. "Some of us learned a lot from the restaurant industry." She turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the center of the ballroom, the Forbes magazine clutched in her trembling hands. Behind her, Sarah heard the low murmur of conversation resume, the guests politely pretending they hadn't witnessed a family drama unfold in their midst. She didn't look back. She had spent too many years looking back, hoping for something that was never there. At the edge of the room, Sarah paused and looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment with a clanking radiator, her kitchen table still sat, the scarred oak surface where she had built Green Grid from nothing. She had kept the apartment, even though she could afford much better now. It reminded her of who she was, of where she came from, of the woman she had become not because of her mother's approval, but in spite of its absence. Vivian appeared at Sarah's elbow, a glass of champagne in each hand. She offered one to Sarah, and she took it. "That was intense," Vivian said quietly. "Are you okay?" Sarah took a sip of champagne. It was excellent, crisp, cold, the kind of champagne they served at galas where billionaires and waitresses mingled as equals. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine. I'm free." Vivian nodded, understanding. She didn't push. She never had. That was one of the reasons Sarah loved her. They stood together at the window, watching the city glitter below. Two women who had taken different paths to the same destination. Sarah's cousin, the lawyer, who had followed the expected route and found her own version of success. And Sarah, the waitress, who had built an empire from a kitchen table, while the world believed she was nothing. Both of them were there. Both of them belonged. And for the first time in her life, Sarah didn't need anyone else to tell her that was true. The new, proud mother had been unveiled for what she was. A woman who only valued her daughter when that daughter's value became visible to others. And Sarah, the waitress who built a billion-dollar grid, had finally spoken the truth that had been silenced for too long. The chapter closed not with reconciliation, but with liberation. A daughter who no longer needed her mother's approval, and a mother left to confront the consequences of years of dismissal and disdain.